Victoria Sterling had everything money could buy. Her penthouse apartment overlooked the glittering city skyline. Her closet held
I
designer
came as soon
clothes
as I
worth
could.
more than most
Is everything
people's
all right?
annual salaries. And her bank account had more zeros than she could count. But as she sat in her marble-floored living room at 3 in the morning, holding a crystal glass of wine that cost more than some people's rent, she felt completely empty inside. The 42-year-old tech mogul had built her empire from nothing. Starting with a small software company in her garage 15 years ago, she had grown it into a billion-dollar corporation that dominated the artificial intelligence market. Victoria Sterling was a name that commanded respect in boardrooms across the world. Business magazines featured her on their covers. Universities invited her to give graduation speeches. Politicians sought her endorsement. Yet tonight, like many nights before, she sat alone in her palace of luxury, wondering if success had cost her everything that truly mattered. The journey to the top had been brutal. 18-hour workdays were normal. Missing family dinners, birthdays, and holidays became routine. Her marriage to David, a kind-hearted architect, had crumbled under the weight of her ambition 3 years ago. The divorce had been messy, filled with accusations and hurt feelings. David had wanted children, a simple life with weekend barbecues and family vacations. Victoria had wanted to change the world through technology. In the end, she got her wish. She changed the world. But she lost David in the process. The irony wasn't lost on her now. Here she was, surrounded by every material comfort imaginable, yet she had never felt more isolated. Her phone buzzed constantly with business calls, interview requests, and meeting invitations. But not one of those calls was from someone who genuinely cared about Victoria the person, rather than Victoria the billionaire. The wine glass slipped from her fingers as exhaustion finally overtook her. The sound of crystal shattering against marble echoed through the empty apartment, much like her heart had shattered when David walked out with his suitcases 3 years ago. Victoria woke up the next morning with a pounding headache and a strange sensation in her chest. At first, she thought it was heartburn from the wine. But as she stood in front of her bathroom mirror, applying her usual armor of perfectly applied makeup, she realized something felt different. Her body felt different. She dismissed the feeling and threw herself into her morning routine. Conference calls with Tokyo, a strategy meeting about the new product launch, interviews with potential vice presidents. The feeling persisted throughout the day, growing stronger rather than fading away. By evening, Victoria couldn't ignore it anymore. The sensation had evolved into something that made her stomach flutter and her heart race in a way that had nothing to do with her high-pressure job. Years of ignoring her body's signals in favor of work had made her forget how to listen to what it was trying to tell her. But this time, her body was practically shouting. Dr. Margaret Chun had been Victoria's physician for over a decade. She was one of the few people who dared to speak honestly to the powerful businesswoman. When Victoria called her personal line at 8 in the evening, demanding an immediate appointment, Dr. Chun knew something serious was happening. "Victoria, I need you to sit down for this, Dr. Chun said after running a series of tests at her private clinic. The usually composed billionaire was pacing around the examination room like a caged animal, checking her phone every few seconds. "Just tell me what's wrong so I can fix it and get back to work," Victoria replied, not even looking up from her emails. "I have a board meeting in the morning that could determine the future of our European expansion." Dr. Chin took off her glasses and looked directly at her patient. "You're pregnant, Victoria." The phone slipped from Victoria's hands and clattered to the floor. For the first time in decades, Victoria Sterling was completely speechless. The woman who had given TED Talks to audiences of thousands, who had negotiated billion-dollar deals with the world's most powerful CEOs, could not form a single word. "That's impossible," she finally whispered. "David and I have been divorced for 3 years. I haven't been with anyone since." "When was your last relationship?" Dr. Chun asked gently. Victoria's mind raced back through the blur of the past few months. Work trips, conferences, late nights at the office. Then, she remembered. The tech conference in San Francisco 2 months ago. Marcus, the charming venture capitalist she had met at the hotel bar. One night of conversation that led to something more. One night of feeling like a woman instead of a machine designed to make money. She had never heard from him again. She hadn't expected to. It was just one night, a brief escape from her isolated existence. "How far along?" Victoria asked, her voice barely audible. "About 8 weeks. You have some decisions to make, Victoria. But, whatever you choose, you need to start taking better care of yourself. No more 18-hour workdays. No more skipping meals. No more treating your body like it's secondary to your business." Victoria left the clinic in a daze. As her driver navigated through the city traffic, she stared out the window at the people walking on the sidewalks. Families with children, couples holding hands, elderly people feeding pigeons in the park. A whole world of human connection that she had shut herself off from in pursuit of success. The next few weeks passed in a blur of morning sickness, doctor's appointments, and the most challenging decision of her life. Victoria had always been decisive. In business, she could analyze data, weigh options, and make choices quickly and confidently. But this decision was different. This wasn't about market share or profit margins. This was about a life growing inside her, a tiny being that would depend on her for everything. The morning sickness was brutal. Victoria, who had never missed a day of work for illness, found herself running to the bathroom during important meetings. Her assistant, Jennifer, began to notice the changes but was too professional to ask questions. Victoria's appetite disappeared, replaced by nausea that seemed to strike at the most inconvenient moments. But even as her body rebelled against her usual routine, Victoria found herself making unexpected changes. She started leaving the office earlier. She began eating regular meals instead of surviving on coffee and energy bars. For the first time in years, she actually read the books on her nightstand instead of just using them as decoration. As her first trimester progressed, Victoria made the decision that would change everything. She was going to have this baby. The realization hit her one evening as she sat in her apartment, finally, understanding that all her success meant nothing if she had no one to share it with. This baby, this unexpected gift, was her chance to build something more meaningful than any company. The pregnancy progressed, and Victoria began to change in ways that surprised even her. The woman who had once fired employees for suggesting she take a vacation now found herself reading parenting books and researching the best pediatricians in the city. She converted one of her spare bedrooms into a nursery, choosing soft pastels instead of her usual stark white and black color scheme. But Victoria Sterling hadn't built a billion-dollar empire by being naive about the world. She knew that being a single mother in her position would come with unique challenges. The media attention alone would be intense. Business rivals might see a pregnant CEO as a sign of weakness. Investors might question her commitment to the company. Most concerning of all was the practical matter of childcare. Victoria's lifestyle had never accommodated the needs of another person. Her schedule was unpredictable, with emergency meetings, overnight flights, and crisis management situations that could arise at any moment. She needed help, but finding the right person to trust with her most precious possession would be one of the most important decisions she would ever make. The solution came from an unexpected source. Jennifer, her assistant, mentioned that her sister worked for a high-end domestic staffing agency that specialized in placing caregivers with wealthy families. The agency, Platinum Care Services, had an impeccable reputation and charged fees that would make most people's eyes water. But money was no object when it came to her child's safety and well-being. Victoria's interview with the agency was more thorough than most job interviews she conducted for her own company. Background checks, references going back decades, psychological evaluations, and even polygraph tests. She wasn't taking any chances. The person she chose would be living in her home, caring for her baby when she couldn't be there, and essentially becoming part of her family. After weeks of interviews and evaluations, the agency presented Victoria with 3 candidates. Each was exceptional in their own way, with years of experience, glowing references, and specialized training in early childhood development. But it was the 3rd candidate that caught Victoria's attention. Grace Williams was 48 years old, with 25 years of experience caring for children in affluent households. She had raised 4 children of her own while working as a nanny, all of whom had gone on to successful careers. Her references described her as patient, loving, and incredibly intuitive when it came to understanding what children needed. But what struck Victoria most about Grace wasn't her impressive resume or her gentle demeanor during the interview. It was the way Grace looked at the ultrasound photo Victoria had shared, her eyes softening with genuine warmth and excitement. In that moment, Victoria saw something she had forgotten existed in her world of corporate transactions and business relationships. She saw authentic human kindness. "I've cared for many babies over the years," Grace had said during their final interview. "But each one teaches me something new about love and patience. Your little one will be lucky to have a mother who cares enough to find them the best possible care." Grace was different from anyone Victoria usually encountered. She spoke with a slight Southern accent that reminded Victoria of her own childhood in Alabama, before she had trained herself to speak with the crisp, authoritative tone that commanded respect in boardrooms. Grace wore simple, practical clothes and carried herself with quiet dignity rather than the aggressive confidence that Victoria was used to in her business world. More importantly, Grace had something that all of Victoria's wealth couldn't buy. She had wisdom earned through decades of nurturing children, of understanding their needs without words, of providing the kind of steady, loving presence that Victoria had never experienced in her own childhood. As Victoria's pregnancy progressed into the third trimester, she found herself looking forward to Grace's visits to prepare the nursery and discuss care plans. Grace had a way of asking gentle questions that helped Victoria think through decisions she had never considered. What kind of schedule would work best for the baby? How did Victoria envision balancing work and motherhood? What were her fears about becoming a parent? These conversations were unlike any Victoria had experienced in years. Grace listened without judgment, offered advice without condescension, and showed genuine interest in Victoria's well-being rather than her net worth or business connections. For someone who had spent years surrounded by people who wanted something from her, Grace's authentic care was both refreshing and slightly unsettling. The birth came 3 weeks early, during what was supposed to be the biggest week of Victoria's professional life. She was scheduled to announce a major acquisition that would expand her company into 3 new markets. Instead, she found herself in a hospital room at 4 in the morning, gripping the rails of her hospital bed as waves of pain crashed over her. The labor was long and difficult. Victoria, who had controlled every aspect of her life for decades, found herself completely powerless against the forces of nature taking over her body. For 18 hours, she experienced a vulnerability she had never known, surrounded by medical professionals who treated her not as a powerful CEO, but as a woman bringing new life into the world. When baby Emma finally arrived, screaming and red-faced and absolutely perfect, Victoria felt something shift inside her chest. It was as if a door she didn't know existed had suddenly opened, flooding her heart with a love so intense it was almost frightening. This tiny, wrinkled human being was completely dependent on her, and, for the first time in her adult life, Victoria felt truly needed rather than just respected or feared. The media attention was immediate and intense. Pictures of Victoria leaving the hospital with baby Emma made the front pages of business magazines and gossip tabloids alike. The story of the tech billionaire's surprise pregnancy dominated social media for days. Stock prices fluctuated as investors tried to determine what this personal development meant for the future of the company. But Victoria barely noticed the media circus. She was completely absorbed in the tiny person who had turned her world upside down. Emma was beautiful in the way that all babies are beautiful to their parents. But Victoria was convinced that her daughter was exceptional. Every tiny movement, every soft sound, every moment of peaceful sleep was a miracle worth watching. The first few weeks at home were a crash course in motherhood that no amount of business experience had prepared Victoria for. Despite all her success in managing complex organizations, she found herself completely stumped by a 6-pound baby who communicated only through crying and seemed to need constant attention. Grace arrived for her first day of work on a rainy Tuesday morning when Emma was 2 weeks old. Victoria had barely slept in days, her hair was unwashed, and she was wearing the same pajamas she had put on 3 days earlier. The confident billionaire who never showed weakness to anyone was an exhausted mess, holding her crying baby and looking completely overwhelmed. "Good morning, Miss Victoria," Grace said softly, setting down her bag and immediately reaching for Emma. "Why don't you go take a shower and get some rest? This little angel," and I are going to get acquainted. Victoria hesitated. She had never been good at accepting help, and letting someone else care for Emma felt like admitting failure. But the sound of running water in her own shower felt like the most luxurious thing she had experienced in weeks. When she emerged 30 minutes later, clean and wearing fresh clothes for the first time in days, she found Grace in the living room with Emma. The baby, who had been crying inconsolably for hours, was now peaceful and content in Grace's arms. Grace was humming softly, swaying gently back and forth, and looking down at Emma with the kind of natural maternal instinct that Victoria worried she would never develop. "She's a sweet baby," Grace said, looking up at Victoria with a warm smile. "Just needed someone to remind her that she's safe and loved. Sometimes that's all any of us need." Victoria felt a mixture of relief and inadequacy. How had Grace managed in 30 minutes what Victoria had been struggling with for 2 weeks? But as she watched the older woman with her daughter, she realized that Grace wasn't trying to replace her or prove her incompetence. She was simply sharing the gift of her experience and knowledge. Over the following days, Grace began to work her quiet magic on Victoria's household. She established routines that seemed to calm both baby Emma and her anxious mother. She prepared nutritious meals that helped Victoria recover her strength. She offered gentle suggestions about feeding schedules and sleep patterns, always framing her advice as options rather than instructions. Most importantly, Grace helped Victoria learn to trust her own instincts as a mother. Instead of taking over completely, she showed Victoria how to read Emma's cues, how to soothe her when she was fussy, how to tell the difference between a hungry cry and a tired cry. Under Grace's patient guidance, Victoria began to feel more confident in her role as a mother. The arrangement worked beautifully. Grace lived in the guest suite and was available around the clock when needed, but she also respected Victoria's desire to be hands-on with her daughter. During the day, while Victoria worked from her home office, Grace cared for Emma with the kind of attention and love that Victoria had always hoped to provide, but wasn't sure she was capable of. Watching Grace with Emma was like observing a master artist at work. She seemed to anticipate the baby's needs before Emma even realized she had them. She could calm a crying spell with gentle words and patient rocking. She made even the most mundane tasks of childcare look effortless and joyful. But it wasn't just Grace's skills that impressed Victoria. It was her genuine affection for Emma. This wasn't just a job for Grace. It was a calling. She spoke to Emma constantly, narrating their daily activities, singing lullabies, and carrying on conversations as if the baby could understand every word. Victoria often found herself pausing her work just to listen to Grace's gentle voice drifting from the nursery. "Miss Emma, your mama works so hard to give you everything you need," Grace would say during feeding time. "She's a strong woman, your mama. You're going to grow up knowing you can do anything you set your mind to." These moments filled Victoria with unexpected emotion. She had never thought about what kind of role model she wanted to be for her daughter, but hearing Grace speak about her strength and determination made her realize that maybe her success could be something positive to pass on rather than just an obstacle to family life. As the weeks passed, Victoria found herself relying on Grace for more than just childcare. Grace became a sounding board for the decisions Victoria was struggling with as a new mother. Should she return to the office or continue working from home? How could she balance her responsibilities to her company with her responsibilities to her daughter? What kind of life did she want to build for Emma? Grace never presumed to have all the answers, but she asked thoughtful questions that helped Victoria think through these challenges in new ways. Her perspective, shaped by years of watching children grow and families evolve, brought wisdom that Victoria's business training had never provided. "Children don't need perfect mothers," Grace observed one afternoon as they watched Emma sleep peacefully in her crib. "They need mothers who love them and are willing to learn alongside them. You're already giving her everything she needs most." These words meant more to Victoria than any business accolade she had ever received. For someone who had spent years measuring success through profit margins and market share, learning to measure success through her daughter's contentment and growth was both challenging and profoundly satisfying. The relationship between Victoria and Grace deepened beyond the typical employer-employee dynamic. Grace brought a warmth and stability to Victoria's home that she hadn't realized was missing. The older woman's presence seemed to calm not just Emma, but Victoria herself. For the first time in years, Victoria's apartment felt like a home rather than just an expensive place to sleep between business trips. Grace shared stories about the other families she had worked with over the years, always maintaining professional discretion, but offering insights into child-rearing that textbooks and parenting websites couldn't provide. She talked about the challenges and joys of raising her own children while working to support them. She spoke with quiet pride about watching the children she had cared for grow into successful, kind adults. "The greatest gift we can give children," Grace said one evening as they prepared Emma's bottle together, "is to help them feel secure enough to become whoever they're meant to be. Love and consistency, that's the foundation for everything else." Victoria found herself treasuring these conversations. Grace's perspective on life was so different from her own, shaped by different experiences and different values, but their common love for Emma created a bond that surprised them both. Victoria began to understand that wealth and success, while providing security and opportunities, were not the most important gifts she could give her daughter. Victoria's investigation into Grace's background began innocently enough. She told herself she was just being a responsible employer, doing her due diligence about someone who had such close access to her home and her daughter. But, deep down, she knew her curiosity went beyond professional concerns. Grace had become too important to their lives for Victoria to remain in the dark about her past. The first clue came accidentally. Victoria was working late in her home office one evening when she heard Grace talking quietly on the phone in the kitchen. The conversation was brief, but something in Grace's tone caught Victoria's attention. There was a weariness in her voice that Victoria had never heard before, a heaviness that contrasted sharply with the gentle warmth Grace always showed with Emma. "I know it's hard, baby," Grace was saying, "but Mama's doing everything she can. This job is good for us. Miss Victoria pays well, and little Emma is such a sweet child. Just hold on a little longer, okay?" Victoria felt guilty for eavesdropping, but she couldn't help wondering who Grace was talking to and what situation required her to hold on. Grace had never mentioned any personal difficulties, never asked for time off for emergencies, never given any indication that she was dealing with challenges outside of work. The next morning, Victoria casually mentioned that she hoped Grace felt comfortable coming to her if she ever needed anything. Grace's response was polite but guarded, thanking Victoria for her kindness, but insisting that everything was fine. Her smile didn't quite reach her eyes, and Victoria sensed there was much more to the story. Victoria's curiosity turned to genuine concern a few days later when she noticed Grace looking exhausted despite her usual professional demeanor. The older woman was still wonderful with Emma, still efficient and caring in all her duties, but there were dark circles under her eyes and a tension in her shoulders that suggested she wasn't sleeping well. "Grace, are you feeling all right?" Victoria asked one afternoon as they prepared Emma's lunch together. "You seem tired lately." "I'm fine, Miss Victoria," Grace replied, but her hands shook slightly as she warmed Emma's bottle. "Just haven't been sleeping as well as usual. Nothing to worry about." Victoria wanted to press for more information, but something in Grace's manner discouraged further questions. The older woman had always maintained professional boundaries, and Victoria respected that. But she also cared about Grace's well-being, both for Grace's sake and because Emma had become so attached to her caregiver. The mystery deepened when Victoria returned home early from a meeting one afternoon to find Grace crying quietly in the nursery while Emma napped. Grace quickly wiped her tears and composed herself when she saw Victoria, but not before Victoria caught a glimpse of the raw pain in her eyes. "Grace, what's wrong?" Victoria asked, abandoning all pretense of professional distance. "Something is clearly bothering you, and I'm worried about you." Grace hesitated for a long moment, looking down at sleeping Emma before finally meeting Victoria's eyes. "It's my son," she said quietly. "My youngest boy, Marcus. He's been sick for a while now, and the treatments are expensive. I've been trying to handle it on my own, but..." Her voice broke, and Victoria felt her heart clench with sympathy. Grace, who had been so strong and supportive for Victoria during her most vulnerable moments as a new mother, was facing her own crisis and had been suffering in silence. "What kind of sick?" Victoria asked gently, sitting down beside Grace in the comfortable chair they had placed beside Emma's crib. "Cancer," Grace whispered, the words seeming to take all her strength. "Leukemia. He's only 22 years old, Miss Victoria. Just graduated from college last year. He was supposed to start his career, maybe find a nice girl to marry, give me grandchildren. Instead, he's lying in a hospital bed fighting for his life." Victoria felt tears prick her own eyes as she listened to Grace's pain. She thought about Emma sleeping peacefully in her crib, about all the hopes and dreams she already had for her daughter's future. The idea of watching Emma suffer from a life-threatening illness was too horrible to contemplate. "Grace, why didn't you tell me?" Victoria asked. "I could have helped. I want to help." Grace shook her head firmly. "This isn't your problem, Miss Victoria. You've already been more generous than I ever expected. I can't ask you for anything more." "You're not asking," Victoria said. "I'm offering. Grace, you've become family to Emma and me. Your problems are my problems now." The conversation that followed revealed the depth of Grace's sacrifice. She had been sending most of her salary to pay for Marcus's treatments, living on the bare minimum to ensure her son received the best possible care. She had been working extra hours when possible, taking on weekend duties without additional pay, all to earn every penny she could for Marcus's medical bills. The insurance coverage was inadequate for the experimental treatments that offered Marcus the best chance of survival. Grace had already sold her car, her furniture, everything of value she owned. She had been considering taking out high-interest loans, despite knowing she might never be able to repay them. Victoria listened to this recitation of financial struggle with growing amazement. Grace had been facing this crisis for months, yet she had never let it affect the quality of care she provided for Emma. She had continued to be patient, loving, and attentive, never allowing her personal worries to impact her professional responsibilities. "How much do you need?" Victoria asked without hesitation. Grace looked startled by the direct question. "Miss Victoria, I couldn't possibly. How much?" Victoria repeated firmly. "Give me a number." Grace reluctantly explained the costs involved. The experimental treatment program cost nearly $200,000, an amount that would take her years to save even with her generous salary from Victoria. The ongoing care and monitoring would require additional funds that seemed impossibly out of reach. To Victoria, $200,000 was a rounding error in her monthly budget. She spent more than that on her apartment's monthly maintenance fees. The amount that represented hope and desperation to Grace was pocket change to someone with Victoria's wealth. "Done," Victoria said simply. "I'll have the money transferred to the hospital today." Grace stared at her in shock. "Miss Victoria, you can't be serious. That's too much money. I could never pay you back." "I don't want you to pay me back," Victoria replied. "This isn't a loan, Grace. It's a gift. You've given Emma and me something priceless: love, stability, peace of mind. This is just money. Money I can afford to give without even thinking about it." Grace broke down completely then, sobbing with relief and gratitude. Victoria found herself crying too, overwhelmed by the realization of how much Grace had been carrying alone. For months, while Victoria had been marveling at Grace's strength and competence, the older woman had been quietly fighting a battle that could have destroyed her family. The next few days brought a whirlwind of activity. Victoria didn't just write a check. She mobilized her considerable resources to ensure Marcus received the best possible care. She contacted the top oncologists in the country, arranged for consultations at leading cancer centers, and made sure that no expense was spared in the fight for Marcus's life. Grace was initially overwhelmed by Victoria's intervention. She had spent so many months feeling helpless and alone that having someone with Victoria's power and resources advocating for Marcus felt almost surreal. But Victoria's commitment was absolute. Marcus wasn't just Grace's son anymore. He was part of their extended family. Victoria accompanied Grace to the hospital for the first time the following weekend. She wanted to meet Marcus, to understand better what Grace was facing, and to ensure that the medical team had everything they needed to provide the best possible treatment. The cancer ward was a sobering environment for someone accustomed to the gleaming offices and luxury hotels of the business world. But Victoria was struck by the strength and dignity of the patients and families they encountered. These people were facing the ultimate test of human resilience, fighting for life itself with courage that made Victoria's business challenges seem trivial by comparison. Marcus Williams was a young man who clearly inherited his mother's gentle nature and inner strength. Despite being weakened by months of treatment, his eyes lit up when he saw Grace, and his gratitude toward Victoria was both humble and profound. "Mama told me what you're doing for us," he said, his voice weak but sincere. "I don't know how to thank you, Miss Victoria. You're giving me a chance to live." Victoria was moved by his dignity in the face of such adversity. Marcus didn't ask for pity or wallow in self-pity. Instead, he talked about his plans for the future, his hopes to return to work once he recovered, his dreams of making his mother proud. His positive attitude and determination reminded Victoria of Grace herself. Meeting Marcus also helped Victoria understand Grace better. The love between mother and son was evident in every interaction, every gentle touch, every concerned glance. Victoria saw where Grace's capacity for nurturing came from. It wasn't just professional training or natural talent. It was the deep love of a mother who had dedicated her life to caring for others. The experimental treatment began immediately. Victoria arranged for Grace to have flexible scheduling so she could be with Marcus during his treatment sessions. She also hired a temporary assistant to help with Emma's care when Grace needed to be at the hospital, ensuring that both Marcus and Emma received the attention they needed. As the weeks passed, Victoria found herself deeply invested in Marcus's recovery. She visited the hospital regularly, not just to support Grace, but because she genuinely cared about the young man's progress. Marcus's courage in facing his illness inspired Victoria in ways she hadn't expected. Watching Grace navigate the challenges of her son's illness while continuing to provide excellent care for Emma gave Victoria a new appreciation for the strength required to be a working mother. Grace was managing a crisis that would have overwhelmed most people, yet she never let her personal struggles interfere with her professional responsibilities. The treatment process was grueling for Marcus, but showed promising signs of progress. The experimental therapy was aggressive, requiring weeks of hospitalization and intensive monitoring. Grace spent her days caring for Emma and her nights at the hospital, surviving on minimal sleep and sheer determination. Victoria began to understand that her relationship with Grace was more complex than she had initially realized. Grace wasn't just an employee providing a service. She was a woman facing her own challenges while offering stability and love to Victoria's family. The power dynamics that Victoria was used to in business relationships didn't apply here. During one of their conversations at the hospital, Grace shared more about her background. She had raised 4 children as a single mother after her husband died in a construction accident when Marcus was just a baby. Working as a nanny had allowed her to support her family while being present for her own children's needs. "I always told my kids that education was the key to a better life," Grace explained as they watched Marcus sleep after a particularly difficult treatment session. "I worked extra jobs to make sure they all went to college. Marcus was the last one, and seeing him graduate was the proudest moment of my life." Victoria learned that Grace's other 3 children had all gone on to successful careers. Her eldest daughter was a nurse, her second son was a teacher, and her third child was an engineer. All of them were contributing to Marcus's medical expenses, but the costs were beyond what any of them could manage alone. The more Victoria learned about Grace's family, the more impressed she became with what the older woman had accomplished. Raising 4 children alone while working demanding jobs, ensuring they all received good educations, instilling in them the values of hard work and compassion, Grace had built something far more valuable than any business empire. This realization forced Victoria to reconsider her own definition of success. She had always measured achievement in terms of financial gain and professional recognition. But Grace's success was measured in different terms. Children who had become productive, caring adults, a reputation for excellence in nurturing other people's children, the respect and love of families who trusted her with their most precious possessions. As Marcus's treatment progressed, Victoria also began to understand the broader implications of healthcare inequality in America. Despite her wealth and success, She had never really considered how devastating medical expenses could be for working families. Grace's situation opened her eyes to a reality that millions of people faced, choosing between financial ruin and losing a loved one. This awareness sparked something new in Victoria's thinking about her wealth and her responsibilities. She had always focused on building her business and accumulating personal wealth. Charitable giving had been limited to tax-deductible donations that enhanced her public image. But seeing Grace's struggle made her question whether she could be using her resources to make a more meaningful difference in people's lives. The transformation in their relationship was gradual but profound. Victoria found herself confiding in Grace about her own challenges and insecurities as a mother and a businesswoman. Grace, in turn, began to share more about her perspectives on life, family, and the things that truly mattered. These conversations often took place in the quiet hours of the evening, after Emma was asleep and before Grace left for her nightly visit to the hospital. They would sit in Victoria's living room, two women from very different backgrounds finding common ground in their shared love for the children in their care. Grace's wisdom extended far beyond childcare techniques. She had insights about resilience, about finding joy in difficult circumstances, about the importance of maintaining hope even when facing overwhelming challenges. Her life experiences had taught her lessons that Victoria's privileged background had never provided. Money can solve many problems, Grace observed one evening, but it can't solve all of them. The most important things in life, love, family, hope, faith, those can't be bought. They have to be earned and nurtured and protected. Victoria found herself questioning many of her previous assumptions about success, happiness, and what made life meaningful. Grace's example showed her that it was possible to find contentment and purpose even without wealth or prestige. The older woman's quiet dignity and unwavering love for her family represented a different kind of achievement than anything Victoria had previously valued. As Marcus's condition continued to improve, Victoria realized that her own life had been fundamentally changed by this experience. She had started her relationship with Grace as an employer seeking quality childcare services. But Grace had become something much more significant, a mentor, a friend, and a window into a different way of understanding what it meant to live a successful life. The medical team was cautiously optimistic about Marcus's response to the treatment. The experimental therapy was working better than anyone had dared to hope. Marcus's energy was returning, his test results were improving, and the doctors were beginning to discuss long-term remission rather than just managing his condition. Grace's relief was evident in everything she did. The tension that had been visible in her shoulders for months began to ease. Her smile became more genuine, her laughter more frequent. She was able to focus more completely on Emma's care because she was no longer carrying the constant worry about Marcus's survival. Victoria celebrated Marcus's progress as if he were her own family member. She arranged for the best rehabilitation services, nutritional support, and follow-up care. But more than the financial support, she provided something that Grace had been lacking for months: hope and companionship in facing an overwhelming challenge. The experience taught Victoria valuable lessons about the responsibilities that came with her wealth and privilege. She began to understand that her resources gave her the power to change lives in immediate, tangible ways. The abstract concept of social responsibility became personal and urgent when she saw how her intervention had literally saved a young man's life. But the story was far from over. As Marcus recovered and their crisis began to resolve, Victoria would discover that there were still surprises in store regarding Grace's background. The revelation that was coming would challenge not just Victoria's assumptions about Grace, but her understanding of herself and the world she had built around her success. The discovery came on a Tuesday morning in late autumn, 6 months after Marcus had begun his recovery. Victoria was in her home office preparing for a board meeting when she received an unexpected phone call that would change everything she thought she knew about Grace Williams. The caller was Detective Sarah Martinez from the City Police Department's Special Investigations Unit. Her voice was professional, but carried an undertone of urgency that immediately caught Victoria's attention. "Ms. Sterling, I'm calling about your employee, Grace Williams. We need to ask you some questions regarding her background and her access to your home. Victoria's blood ran cold. Her first thought was that something had happened to Grace or Marcus. Is Grace okay? Has something happened? Ms. Williams is fine, but we've received information that requires us to investigate her employment with your family. Would it be possible for us to meet today? This is a matter of some urgency. The detective wouldn't provide details over the phone, but her tone made it clear that this wasn't a routine inquiry. Victoria agreed to meet at her home that afternoon, her mind racing with possibilities. What could the police possibly want to know about Grace? Detective Martinez arrived with a partner, Detective Johnson, and both carried themselves with the serious demeanor of experienced investigators. They were polite but thorough in their questions about Grace's employment, her duties, her access to Victoria's home, and financial information, and any unusual behavior Victoria might have noticed. Ms. Sterling, what do you know about Ms. Williams' background prior to her employment with you? Detective Martinez asked, consulting a thick file that she kept mostly closed during their conversation. I know she has 25 years of experience as a nanny, excellent references, and for children of her own, Victoria replied. She came to me through Platinum Care Services, a very reputable agency. They conducted extensive background checks. The detectives exchanged glances. Ms. Sterling, we need to inform you that Grace Williams is not who she appears to be, Detective Johnson said carefully. The woman you know as Grace Williams has been living under an assumed identity for the past 15 years. Victoria felt the world tilt beneath her feet. What do you mean, assumed identity? Are you saying Grace isn't her real name? The woman you know as Grace Williams was born Grace Washington. 15 years ago, she was convicted of embezzling money from her employer, a wealthy family in Connecticut. She served 3 years in prison and was released under supervised probation. She subsequently changed her name and created false documentation to hide her criminal record. The words hit Victoria like physical blows. Grace, the woman she trusted with her most precious possession, the woman who had become like family to her, and Emma, was a convicted criminal who had been lying about her identity for years. That's impossible, Victoria whispered. The agency did background checks. They verified her references. She's been caring for my daughter for months. The false documentation was very sophisticated, Detective Martinez explained. It's taken us considerable time and resources to uncover the truth. We only discovered it because we're investigating the agency itself for placement fraud. Ms. Washington, the woman you know as Grace Williams, appears to have paid substantial sums to create her new identity and fake her employment history. Victoria's mind reeled as she tried to process this information. Everything she thought she knew about Grace was a lie. The references, the employment history, even her name, all of it fabricated. How could she have been so completely deceived? What exactly did she steal? Victoria asked, her voice barely audible. Detective Johnson consulted his notes. She embezzled approximately $50,000 from the Morrison family over a period of 2 years. She had access to their financial accounts and credit cards as part of her duties managing their household. The thefts were sophisticated and continued until the family's accountant discovered the discrepancies. Victoria felt sick to her stomach. Grace had access to her bank accounts, her credit cards, and her home security systems. She could have stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars without Victoria noticing. More terrifyingly, she had unlimited access to Emma. What else do you need to know? Victoria asked, her executive training helping her focus despite the shock. We need you to review your financial records for any unusual activity, Detective Martinez said. We also need to know if Ms. Washington has ever asked you for money, gifts, or access to additional financial resources. Victoria thought immediately of the money she had given Grace for Marcus's medical treatment. $200,000, transferred without hesitation or verification. At the time, it had seemed like a generous gesture towards someone who had become family. Now, it looked like she had been the victim of an elaborate con. She did ask me for money, Victoria admitted, feeling foolish. $200,000 for her son's cancer treatment. I gave it to her willingly. I thought I was helping family. The detectives looked troubled. Ms. Sterling, we need to investigate whether this medical situation is legitimate or part of an ongoing fraud. Can you provide us with details about the hospital, the doctors, and the treatment program? Victoria provided all the information she had. But doubt was creeping in about everything she had believed. Was Marcus really sick? Were the hospital visits genuine? Had she been manipulated into providing money for a fictional medical emergency? The investigation that followed was thorough and invasive. Financial experts examined Victoria's accounts for unauthorized transactions. Private investigators verified the details of Marcus's medical treatment. Background specialists dug deeper into Grace's true history and the extent of her deception. Meanwhile, Victoria faced the agonizing decision of what to do about Grace's continued presence in her home. The detectives advised her to maintain normal routines while the investigation proceeded, but Victoria struggled to act naturally around the woman she now knew had been lying to her for months. Watching Grace care for Emma became torture. Every gentle touch, every loving word, every moment of apparent affection was now tainted by the knowledge that Grace was a convicted criminal who had built her entire relationship with them on lies. How could someone fake such genuine-seeming love and care? The emotional turmoil was even more difficult than the potential financial loss. Victoria had opened her heart to Grace in a way she rarely did with anyone. She had shared her fears and insecurities as a new mother. She had welcomed Grace into her family and trusted her with Emma's well-being. The betrayal felt more personal and devastating than any business setback she had ever experienced. 3 days into the investigation, Victoria couldn't maintain the facade any longer. She confronted Grace directly, in the privacy of her home office after Emma was asleep. "Grace," she began, her voice steady despite her emotional turmoil. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth." Grace looked up from the baby monitor she had been adjusting, her expression showing immediate concern at Victoria's serious tone. "Of course, Miss Victoria. What is it? Is Grace Williams your real name?" The question hung in the air between them. Victoria watched as Grace's face went through a series of emotions: surprise, fear, resignation, and, finally, a deep sadness that seemed to confirm Victoria's worst fears. Grace sank into a chair, her hands trembling as she set down the baby monitor. "How did you find out?" The simple question was an admission of guilt that made Victoria's heart break. Part of her had been hoping that the police were wrong, that there was some explanation that would clear Grace and restore their relationship. Instead, she was faced with the confirmation that everything had been a lie. "The police came to see me," Victoria said quietly. "They're investigating the agency. They told me about Connecticut, about the embezzlement, about Grace Washington." Grace closed her eyes and took a deep breath before speaking. When she opened them again, there were tears streaming down her cheeks. "Miss Victoria, I need you to know that everything I feel for you and Emma is real. The love, the care, the commitment, none of that was fake. But everything else was," Victoria replied, her own voice breaking. "Your name, your background, your references. You're a convicted criminal, Grace. You embezzled money from another family who trusted you." "Yes," Grace whispered. "I did. And I've regretted it every day for the past 15 years. But please, let me explain." "Explain what?" Victoria interrupted, her emotions finally overflowing. "How you lied to me from the moment we met. How you gained access to my home, my daughter, my financial information under false pretenses. How you convinced me to give you $200,000 for what might be a fictional medical emergency." Grace flinched as if Victoria had struck her. "Marcus is real, Miss Victoria. His illness is real. The hospital records, the doctors, the treatment, all of it is documented and legitimate. I would never lie about my child's life." Victoria wanted to believe her, but trust had been shattered. How could she distinguish between truth and lies when Grace had been deceiving her about fundamental facts for months? "Tell me everything," Victoria demanded. "The real story. No more lies." Grace took a shuddering breath and began to tell her story, the real one this time. She had indeed been Grace Washington, working as a household manager for the Morrison family in Connecticut. She had a young family to support and an ex-husband who provided no financial assistance. "I didn't start out intending to steal from them," Grace explained, her voice hollow with shame. "Mrs. Morrison was elderly and beginning to show signs of dementia. She would forget about payments she had authorized or purchases she had made. I started by helping her balance her checkbook, and eventually, I had access to all her financial accounts. The thefts had begun small. Grace had borrowed money for genuine emergencies, medical bills for her children, car repairs, rent when her ex-husband disappeared, and left her with no support. She had always intended to pay it back, but the amounts grew larger and the opportunities to repay them never materialized. I told myself I was just borrowing, Grace continued, unable to meet Victoria's eyes. Mrs. Morrison had so much money, and I was struggling so hard to keep my family together. But I know that's just an excuse. I was stealing from someone who trusted me, and there's no justification for that. The theft had continued for 2 years before the family's accountant discovered the discrepancies. Grace had been arrested, prosecuted, and sentenced to 5 years in prison, serving 3 before being released on parole. Her children had been placed with relatives while she served her sentence. Those 3 years in prison were the worst of my life, Grace said, her voice barely audible. Not because of the conditions, but because I was separated from my children. I had destroyed their security and stability because of my poor choices. I promised myself that if I ever got out, I would spend the rest of my life making it up to them. Upon her release, Grace had found it impossible to get legitimate employment. Her criminal record made her unemployable in any position that involved financial responsibility or working in people's homes. Despite her genuine skills and experience in childcare, no reputable agency would represent her. I created the new identity because it was the only way I could work in the field I knew best, Grace explained. I spent my entire savings on false documentation because I needed to support my children and I had no other marketable skills. The transformation from Grace Washington to Grace Williams had been complete. She had moved to a different state, created an entirely fictional employment history, and paid substantial bribes to get placed with high-end domestic agencies. For 15 years, she had worked under her false identity, providing excellent care for wealthy families while sending money home to support her children's education and her own mother's medical care. I never stole from any of the families I worked for after Connecticut, Grace said firmly. Never. Not a penny. I learned my lesson, Miss Victoria. I knew I could never risk destroying another family's trust or putting my own children through that trauma again. Victoria listened to this confession with mixed emotions. The story Grace told was heartbreaking and humanizing, but it didn't change the fundamental fact that she had built their entire relationship on lies. Even if her feelings for Victoria and Emma were genuine, she had manipulated them through deception. What about Marcus? Victoria asked. Is his illness real? Every word I told you about Marcus is true, Grace replied with passion. The leukemia, the treatments, the medical bills, all of it is real and documented. I can provide you with hospital records, doctor's reports, anything you need to verify the truth. Victoria studied Grace's face, searching for any sign of deception. The older woman met her gaze directly, her eyes filled with pain but also with unwavering conviction about her son's condition. Despite everything, Victoria found herself believing this part of Grace's story. Why didn't you tell me the truth? Victoria asked. When we became close, when I started caring about you and your family, why didn't you trust me enough to be honest? Grace's tears flowed freely now. Because I was afraid of exactly what's happening right now. I was afraid you would hate me and send me away. I was afraid you would think everything I felt for you and Emma was fake. Miss Victoria, you and Emma have become the most important people in my life. Losing you would be devastating. Victoria felt her own tears threatening to fall. Despite her anger and sense of betrayal, she couldn't deny the genuine emotion in Grace's voice or the authentic care she had shown for Emma over the months they had been together. The love Grace had demonstrated seemed real, even if the foundation of their relationship had been built on lies. I don't know what to do now, Victoria admitted. The police are investigating. The agency is under scrutiny. You could be arrested for identity fraud, and I have to think about Emma's safety. I understand, Grace said quietly. I know I have no right to ask for anything from you. I've betrayed your trust in the worst possible way. But please believe me when I say that everything I feel for you and Emma is real. Whatever happens to me, please don't let this experience make you lose faith in people entirely. The conversation ended with no resolution. Grace packed her belongings and moved out that same night, understanding that Victoria needed time and space to process the revelation. The temporary nanny Victoria hired to replace Grace was competent, but impersonal, highlighting just how special Grace's presence had been. Emma, who had formed a strong attachment to Grace, was clearly confused and upset by her sudden disappearance. The baby cried more frequently and seemed to search the apartment for the woman who had been such a constant, loving presence in her life. Victoria struggled with the investigation's findings. The financial review revealed no unauthorized transactions or missing money beyond the amount Victoria had willingly given for Marcus's treatment. Grace had indeed refrained from stealing from the Sterling family, despite having ample opportunity to do so. The medical records for Marcus were thoroughly investigated and confirmed to be legitimate. The young man was indeed suffering from leukemia, had undergone the expensive experimental treatment that Victoria's money had funded, and was responding well to therapy. Grace had not lied about her son's condition or manipulated Victoria's sympathy for financial gain. These findings complicated Victoria's feelings about the situation. Grace was undeniably a criminal who had deceived her about fundamental aspects of her identity. But she was also a woman who had genuinely cared for Emma, had not stolen from their family despite having the opportunity, and had been truthful about the medical emergency that prompted Victoria's financial assistance. The investigation into the domestic agency revealed widespread fraud and corruption. Grace was one of dozens of employees working under false identities, and the agency had been complicit in helping criminals create new backgrounds to work in wealthy homes. The scandal made national news, highlighting the vulnerability of affluent families who trusted their most precious possessions to caregivers with fabricated histories. As the media coverage intensified, Victoria found herself at the center of a story that exposed the complex intersections of class, privilege, crime, and redemption. The business press portrayed her as a victim of sophisticated fraud. The tabloids sensationalized the story of the billionaire who was deceived by her criminal nanny. But Victoria's own feelings were far more complicated than any media narrative could capture. She had been lied to and deceived, but she had also witnessed genuine love and care. Grace had a criminal past, but she had also demonstrated years of reformed behavior and authentic commitment to the family she served. The question that haunted Victoria was whether people deserved second chances, and whether someone's past mistakes should define them forever. Grace had paid for her crimes with prison time and years of living under a false identity. She had worked hard to support her family and had provided excellent care for the children entrusted to her. Most importantly, Victoria had to decide what was best for Emma. The baby clearly missed Grace, and the woman's departure had disrupted the stability and routine that had been so beneficial for Emma's development. But could Victoria ever trust Grace again, knowing that their relationship had been founded on lies? The answer came from an unexpected source. Marcus, still recovering from his treatment, but growing stronger every day, requested a meeting with Victoria. Against the advice of her lawyers and security team, Victoria agreed to see the young man who had been at the center of the financial transaction that first revealed Grace's desperation. Marcus met Victoria at a neutral location, a quiet cafe near the hospital where he was still receiving follow-up treatment. He looked healthy for someone who had been fighting cancer, his color improved and his energy returning. But his eyes held a maturity and seriousness that spoke of someone who had faced mortality at a young age. "Miss Victoria, I need to thank you for saving my life," Marcus began, his voice steady despite the emotional weight of the conversation. "But I also need to tell you some things about my mother that maybe she was too ashamed to say herself." Marcus told Victoria about growing up with Grace as a single mother after their father died. He described the sacrifices she had made to ensure all 4 of her children received good educations and had opportunities for better lives than she had been able to provide for herself. "When my mother was arrested in Connecticut, it destroyed our family," Marcus explained. "Not because we stopped loving her, but because we realized how desperate she must have been to risk everything for us. She never told us how bad things were financially. She never let us see her struggle." Marcus described visiting Grace in prison, seeing his proud, strong mother reduced to wearing a prison uniform and living in a cell. But he also described her determination to rebuild her life and make amends for her mistakes. For 15 years, my mother has sent money home to support our family, even though she was living under a false name and could have been arrested at any time, Marcus continued. She put all four of us through college. She took care of our grandmother until she died. She never missed a birthday, graduation, or important moment in our lives, even though she had to travel carefully to avoid detection. Victoria listened to this account of Grace's life after prison with growing understanding. The woman who had cared for Emma was someone who had spent 15 years trying to atone for her past mistakes while building a life dedicated to serving others. Miss Victoria, I know my mother lied to you. And I know that's hard to forgive, Marcus said. But I also know that the love she has for you and Emma is completely real. She talks about you both constantly. You've become the family she lost when she went to prison. Marcus's words forced Victoria to confront her own prejudices and assumptions. She had been ready to write off Grace entirely because of her criminal past, but Marcus's testimony painted a picture of someone who had spent 15 years earning redemption through her actions rather than her words. The conversation with Marcus led Victoria to do something she rarely did. She asked for advice. She reached out to friends, family members, and trusted advisors, seeking perspectives on forgiveness, redemption, and second chances. The responses she received were as varied as the people she consulted. Some urged her to never trust Grace again, arguing that the deception was too fundamental to overlook. Others suggested that Grace's actions after her conviction spoke more loudly than her past mistakes. Victoria's own mother, a woman she rarely spoke to due to their complicated relationship, offered perhaps the most insightful perspective. Victoria, you've spent your whole life building walls to protect yourself from being hurt or disappointed. But sometimes those walls also keep out the love and connection you're looking for. This observation hit Victoria deeply. She realized that her reaction to Grace's deception wasn't just about the lies. It was about her fear of vulnerability and her tendency to retreat from emotional connections when they became complicated or risky. The decision Victoria ultimately made surprised everyone who knew her, including herself. After weeks of investigation, soul-searching, and consultation with experts in criminal justice and child psychology, she asked Grace to return. But the terms of Grace's return were different from their original arrangement. Victoria insisted on complete transparency about Grace's past, present, and future. She required Grace to undergo counseling to address the underlying issues that had led to her criminal behavior. She also established new boundaries and oversight procedures to protect both her family's interests and Grace's opportunity for continued redemption. Most importantly, Victoria committed to helping Grace clear her legal status. She hired the best criminal lawyers to explore options for resolving Grace's outstanding legal issues and potentially clearing her record through rehabilitation programs and community service. Grace's return to the Sterling household was emotional and complicated. Emma's joy at seeing her beloved caregiver again was immediate and obvious, but the relationship between Victoria and Grace required careful rebuilding. Trust that had been shattered needed to be reconstructed piece by piece. The process wasn't easy. Victoria struggled with moments of doubt and suspicion. Grace carried the weight of shame about her deception even as she worked to prove her commitment to honesty going forward. But gradually, through honest conversations and consistent actions, they began to rebuild their relationship on a more authentic foundation. The experience changed Victoria's understanding of justice, redemption, and the complexity of human nature. She learned that people were capable of both terrible mistakes and genuine transformation. Grace's story forced her to confront her own privilege and the way that desperation could drive good people to make bad choices. More importantly, Victoria learned about the power of forgiveness, not just for Grace's benefit, but for her own. Holding on to anger and betrayal was exhausting and limiting. Choosing to believe in Grace's capacity for redemption opened up possibilities for deeper connection and understanding than Victoria had ever experienced. The media never learned about Grace's return to the Sterling household. Victoria used her influence and resources to keep the family's private arrangements out of the public eye. But within their home, a new dynamic had emerged. one based on honesty, mutual respect, and the recognition that people were complex beings capable of both failure and growth. Emma continued to thrive under Grace's care, but now Victoria was more present and involved in her daughter's daily life. The crisis had taught Victoria that her most important role was not as a CEO, but as a mother, and that success in that role required presence, attention, and emotional investment. Grace's legal status was gradually resolved through Victoria's intervention and Grace's own commitment to making amends. She participated in victim restitution programs, performed community service, and eventually had her record cleared through a rehabilitation program designed for nonviolent offenders who had demonstrated genuine reform. Marcus completed his treatment successfully and returned to building his career and his life. The entire Williams family was grateful for Victoria's intervention in his medical crisis, but they were even more grateful for her willingness to give Grace a second chance at redemption and belonging. Years later, as Emma grew from a baby into a curious, confident child, Victoria often reflected on the lessons she had learned from Grace's presence in their lives. She learned that love and trust could coexist with vigilance and boundaries. She discovered that people's worth wasn't defined by their worst mistakes, but by their capacity for growth and change. Most importantly, Victoria learned that true family wasn't always determined by blood or legal documents. Sometimes it was formed through shared commitment, mutual care, and the willingness to see beyond surface appearances to the human heart beneath. Grace had become family not because she was perfect, but because she was willing to be real, with all the messiness and complexity that authenticity required. The billionaire mom who had started this journey looking for quality childcare had found something much more valuable, a deeper understanding of herself, her capacity for forgiveness, and the true meaning of family. Grace's presence in their lives had been a gift wrapped in deception, but ultimately it had led to discoveries about love, redemption, and human connection that no amount of money could have purchased. The seeds of that discovery had already been planted. Victoria's investigation into Grace's background had been interrupted by the medical crisis, but her curiosity about the woman who had become so important to her family remained. When she finally uncovered the truth about Grace's past, it would force her to confront uncomfortable realities about privilege, prejudice, and the true meaning of worth. For now, though, Victoria was content to watch Emma thrive under Grace's continued care while celebrating Marcus's recovery. She had no idea that the most challenging and transformative part of their story was still ahead of them. The revelation that awaited would test not just their relationship, but Victoria's character and her commitment to the values she claimed to hold. The comfortable routine they had established was about to be disrupted by a discovery that would force all of them to confront truths they had been avoiding. Grace's past held secrets that would challenge everything Victoria thought she knew about the woman who had become like family to her and Emma. The next phase of their story would require more courage and growth than anything Victoria had faced in her business career. As Emma grew from a newborn into an alert, responsive baby, Victoria watched in amazement as Grace seemed to understand exactly what the little girl needed at each stage of development. Grace introduced age-appropriate toys and activities, created stimulating but not overwhelming environments, and, most importantly, provided the kind of consistent, patient love that helped Emma thrive. Victoria's business continued to flourish, but her priorities had fundamentally shifted. She still worked hard and made important decisions for her company, but she no longer stayed at the office until midnight or scheduled meetings 7 days a week. Emma's needs came first, and everything else had to fit around that central reality. The arrangement with Grace allowed Victoria to have the best of both worlds. She could maintain her role as CEO while being present for Emma's important moments. Grace made it possible for Victoria to attend board meetings knowing that Emma was receiving the best possible care, and to focus on her daughter knowing that her business was continuing to run smoothly in her absence. But, as perfect as the situation seemed, Victoria couldn't shake the feeling that there was something she didn't know about Grace. The older woman never talked about her personal life beyond brief mentions of her own children. She lived simply despite the generous salary Victoria paid her. And sometimes, Victoria caught glimpses of a sadness in Grace's eyes that she couldn't quite understand. Victoria's curiosity about Grace's background grew stronger as the months passed. Grace had become such an important part of their daily life, such a crucial figure in Emma's development, that Victoria felt she should know more about the woman who was helping to raise her daughter. But Grace maintained professional boundaries that Victoria, despite her usual directness in getting information she wanted, found difficult to cross. The question of Grace's past became more pressing as Victoria realized how much she had come to depend on her. This wasn't just about childcare anymore. Grace had become family in a way that Victoria had never expected. The thought of losing her was almost unbearable, but Victoria also knew that she needed to understand who Grace really was and what had brought her into their lives. The answer would come sooner than Victoria expected, and it would challenge everything she thought she knew about the woman who had become so important to both her and Emma. The truth about Grace's past would force Victoria to confront her own assumptions and prejudices in ways that would change not just how she saw Grace, but how she saw herself and the world around her.